Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fourth Funding Talks event. My name is Clara. I'm the founder of our startup community, Check and Shine, and I'll be our host today. So today we have two really exciting speakers joining us for this talk, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with them because they have both been very inspiring. I was very lucky to have a few chats with them before our event today, and they're truly brilliant. So really excited to have them here. Sorry about our delay today. We had a bit of a technical issue, so hopefully you will be able to hear our speakers today. We might have a bit of a podcast version of an event, so we'll see how things go. Nothing is ever perfect in the online world. And before I invite our speakers to the stage, I just have a few words about our community for those of you who have not been to our events yet. So Czech and Shine is a community for startupers currently living in the Czech Republic, and we focus on founders in the sort of idea early stage of their companies. What we do are events like the one you're attending today, but we also have a great blog with interviews and different resources. We have an epic startup newsletter. We have a network of mentors you can reach out to, as well as we help interns get their first jobs in startups. Basically, when it comes to our events and anything we do at Check and Shine, we try to focus on the three pillars that you can see, which are education, inspiration, and networking. So hopefully you had a chance to sit down to one of the networking tables today before the event. You will have a chance to do the same after the event. We'll still have the networking tables open. I'll be there as well. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with everyone. And hopefully you'll get some inspiration from today's event. When it comes to our mentors, we have mentors from these amazing companies and much more on our website. There's over 30 mentors at the moment, and you can just easily filter out your current needs and questions and choose a mentor you would like to work with and just contact them directly. So I definitely encourage you to do so. And if you're not a member of our community yet, please find us on Facebook at Czech Startup Community. We actually have a little over 1,100 members at the moment, and our community is really a safe space to ask questions about your business, share feedback, connect with other founders like yourself. So looking forward to seeing you there as well. So don't forget to follow us on our resources. Don't forget to follow us on our social and website. And let's get to it. So I would like to invite our speakers to the stage. Today we'll be talking with Bryan from Index Ventures and with Tomas from Enern. All right, so let's see if we'll be able to hear our speakers. And let's get to it. Bryan, can you hear me?
I can indeed. Hopefully everyone can hear me. As Clara mentioned, apologize for the video issues, but we're having a bit of a 2021 problem, but excited to be here.
Awesome. Let me just quickly stop screen sharing. I see we have Tom here as well. Hi, Tom.
Hi, everyone.
All right, let's get to it. So thank you both so much for being here with me today. Let's start with a bit of an introduction of you, your stories, and the companies you work. Tom, why don't you kick things off?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here. And back to your question, I've started my career as a software engineer, and after a couple of short stints in the software development, I quickly realized that it's just not for me, and I got lured into the world of investments and finance. But after a couple of years, I felt that I was still missing that angle of technology and the tech that I was part of at the beginning. And I had the opportunity to join Enern back in 2013, so more than 7 years ago. And I'm very grateful for that, because I was able to learn and meet amazing founders and back them on their journey on building companies. And that's in a nutshell what we do at Enern. We back ambitious founders that are trying to make a dent and that are trying to change and shape the industry that they operate in, be it on global level or on regional level. We can imagine being the first money in the company, but we can also invest at the later stages, still within the realm of early stage investing, which is Series A. So that's where we would also feel comfortable. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that we can be very creative and flexible if we like something. So we don't sort of put founders in buckets that, hey, this is not for me, or we don't operate here. We really try to keep an open mind and back the ambition and try to make it work for both sides if we like something. So when it comes to the size of the investments that we make, we can start at sort of low hundreds, thousands of euros and go all the way up to sort of 1.5 to 2 million euros as a first investment that we make. In terms of what we invest in, we are sector agnostic, although we do have affinity for some sectors based on personal preference or based on history that we have had with similar investments in the past. But as I said, we try to keep an open mind, and we have a motto of saying that we look for opportunities in the unusual places, be it the founders, region, or sector or business model. So we try to live by that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the introduction, Tom. It's great to have you here. Bryan, over to you.
Yeah, I would echo Tom's statement. Thank you for having me. This should be super fun. And similar to Tom, I come from an engineering background, so studied artificial intelligence in college. And at the time realized that, you had to go get a PhD to do anything super interesting there. So instead decided to go into a more traditional software engineering role. I was at Palantir Technologies for a couple of years working on predominantly software infrastructure and data infrastructure, and then at a database company called MemSQL. So as a product manager. So my background is predominantly in data infrastructure technologies, but I've done everything from search to data ingestion to database stuff, kind of a little bit all over the place. And then I've been here at Index for about 2.5 years now, investing in technologies mostly in those spaces. Index as a fund, we do a little bit of everything. We're international, so we're kind of co-headquartered in London, in the United States, and San Francisco, which is where I'm based. Investing from seed all the way to Series H is the joke. Slack raised a Series H a year or two ago, which we participated. So happy to participate in investment rounds all the way from a PowerPoint to just pre-IPO.
Amazing. Thank you for the intro, Bryan. And we're, again, super excited to have you here today. So let's get right to it. You both mentioned that you participate from the smaller rounds to even the larger ones. And we'll be talking about kind of the nuts and bolts of Series A and what that looks like, how the founders can really prepare before actually going to raise a Series A round, what happens during the funding and what happens after. So Tom, my first question to you would actually be, what does sort of the common trait of the companies you actually invest in look like? What are the similarities? What do the companies have in common in your portfolio?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Clara. I think it's a very good question because sometimes, in some occasions, the sort of the VC or the role of venture capitalists is over-glorified. And I think it's important to understand how actually a VC fund works. What are the dynamics from a very high level? And just so to that end, a typical fund in the region of Central Europe, say for the sake of this example, would be sort of, let's say it's a 50 million euros. And the way that the venture funds work is that there is a power law. So most of the returns of the fund are driven by a very small number of companies. Sometimes it's one, maybe two companies that deliver that. And in order for that to happen, you need to have, with every single investment that you make, you need to have a shot at returning the fund or so-called fund returner. And that's why people sort of chase all of these unicorns or companies of a certain size. That's just because that for the dynamics of a certain fund to work, there needs to be a certain size of a company. And if it's not, that doesn't mean that the company is bad business. It just means it's not for that particular company. So I think one of the most important traits is that you need to understand who are you talking to, how big their fund is, and therefore understand what sort of company they need to invest in, how big your ambition needs to be if you want to be investable by a VC company, by a VC fund. It doesn't mean that you have a bad business if you don't get the VC funding. It just means that it's for a different sort of capital, or it has a different growth profile. And on the original question, I think not all companies are created equal. You have companies that have better margins or higher margins or lower margins. You have companies that are chasing larger pools of profit, albeit with smaller margins. You have companies that have easier scaling than others, and then you have companies that have better protected margins in the future through technology or some structural things in the industry. So the things that we like to see in companies that we invest in is that they are of a certain size, or they have a realistic shot at being of a certain size, sort of being that on the regional level. They use technology, or they can leverage technology for scaling. They don't necessarily have to be software businesses, but they can be technology-enabled businesses, and that they have an explanation, or they have a path to protect their business in the future. They understand how that can be built into their product or into their position on the market. That, in summary, would be what we are looking for. And obviously, there is a whole topic around founders, but I think that's not part of this question. So I would maybe leave it for later if that comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely be asking about the different patterns and founders that you might be looking for. But when you said you are interested in companies that can go a certain size, you mean in terms of markets, right? That would be like the most important metric you mean by size. Yes,
it basically means how big the company in value can be, how much money it can return to the fund over time. If it's a company that has a shot at being 50 million euros in size, it's a great business. But for some funds of a certain size, it just wouldn't be big enough.
Absolutely. You mentioned that some companies just simply doesn't mean that they are not a great companies, but they are not VC scalable, as we would say. Bryan, what does to you and to Index Ventures a VC scalable startup look like?
Yeah. I think to Tom's point, it's a function of largely market size and then secondarily speed, right? So I think, to put it very simply, do you believe that this business, let's say it's a seed company, right? Because you're going to shift that timeline depending on how far along the journey the company is. But for a new company, is it feasible that this company can become a publicly traded company in a 7 to 10 year time horizon? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it's probably a VC backable business. To Tom's point, what that means from a kind of business fundamentals perspective varies dramatically, right? So I work in invest predominantly in B2B businesses and infrastructure. And for that, you're looking at something that can get to, call it $150 million in annual recurring revenue at 80% margins, right? Obviously, there are other public businesses that have very, very dramatically different profiles, right? So think about a DoorDash or an Uber, right? Their margins are going to be way, way lower, but the volume of revenue that they're doing is obviously going to be much, much higher. So the details of what that looks like depends on the sector you're operating in. But I think the single thread that holds them all together is, can you scale this to a public business in 7 to 10 years? Is kind of the metric you look for in a venture backable business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So, to kind of help us define the concept of Series A, Bryan, to your knowledge and experience, when is a startup not ready for Series A? What are the things that they still maybe need to work on? What might be some of the issues they still need to tackle before they actually go out and raise a Series A round?
Yeah. I think this is rapidly evolving. And my perspective is going to be a bit skewed to the US markets because that's where I spend most of my time. But I think you are seeing, in general, Series A's that are being raised earlier than 6 months ago, and certainly than a year or two ago. And so from a kind of business foundation perspective, I think Series A's are starting to look a little bit more like seeds, right? Historically, I think that the answer to your question would be you have some semblance of product market fit, right? Where the seed is to kind of try to find that product market fit and prove it out, a few early customers, maybe a little bit of revenue. Again, what that metric looks like really depends on your business. And I think one of the keys in the early days is to figure out what that metric is for the business that you're operating in. But you want that metric to look pretty good, where it feels like you can take on some additional capital to really kickstart that. And then the Series B is like, well, now we know we have product market fit. We have a repeatable sales motion. Let's pour capital onto that to scale that sales motion, right? I think increasingly the things that you need to have for a Series A is more around clarity than actual proof of product market fit, right? So you want to be able to go in and say, hey, look, we've hired this team of people with relevant backgrounds. Here's exactly what we're going to go build. And here's feedback from a variety of people saying, hey, we would use it. Here's what we would use it for. And we're excited about it, right? So maybe you don't actually need as much of the actual traction, but a lot of clarity in terms of what you're actually going to go build. So if you don't have that clarity, I think that's really an indication that you're not quite ready to raise that Series A. Because mentally, for me, when you raise seed funding, I think you still offer yourself a little bit of the ability to kind of explore things, and it's understood that you're trying to find that product market fit. The expectation with the Series A, particularly a sizable one, is that you're gonna take a rock and put it on that accelerator, and you're gonna really get after it. And so you just want to be sure that before you take on that additional velocity, you kind of know which way you're driving. So clarity of vision, I think, is the single most important thing for raising a Series A. And then what you need in terms of business fundamentals around that, I think, will evolve and change over time and depend on the nature of the market you're operating in, the geography you're operating in, all sorts of different factors.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually love the way that you sort of explained that, they should be sort of taking that rock and accelerating it and making it fly. And I think that companies still have some opportunity to, to explore features and, add a bit more to their products. But the core should be the core should be still, right? The core should be already sort of experimented through and understood, so that you can invest heavily, as you mentioned, in sales force or in sales power, and really then measure, where you churn, what's your retention, et cetera, et cetera. So, Tom, opposite question to you, what are the things, what does a company that's ready for Series A look like? What are some of the, what you see in your startups, what you see in other companies as well, outside of your portfolio, when, or do you often see founders think that they're ready too soon or too late? What are the things that show that you're ready to go and raise the Series A and really scale your company?
Yeah, I think I agree with Bryan that it very much depends on the market and also on the founder, and that some Series A rounds look a lot like seed rounds still. I think it's a function of a lot more capital being available and chasing founders and concepts and lowering the sort of the bar for what it needs to prove before it receives money, but also B, the fact that things around scaling are much more sort of been than done that there are people who know how to go about it, and finding the product market fit is much more nuanced and difficult thing to do. So I think some founders that are very good fundraisers and that are good at narratives can still raise Series A's with a very good narrative and less traction than founders that originally would have to just prove the numbers and show that this thing works and that you do have at least sort of you're close to product market fit. So I would say that there are two types of companies or two types of founders. One is that they can still work partly on that narrative and raise money and don't necessarily have that sort of product market fit understanding and the sales machine, at least the first signs of the sales machine that sort of is starting to hum and is starting to understand which channels can work and how you can scale that. And then there are other founders that don't have the benefit of sort of being a second or third time founder, and they just have to come to the market and prove that they actually do know how to go about scaling and that they do know about what that product market fit and have numbers that can prove it. And those numbers, I mean, there's a lot of articles that have been written about what product market fit is. So, it's almost this magical term of things that are very hard to describe. Some have tried to quantify it. I think Rahul Vohra from Superhuman did a very good job at that. And these are the things that we see, that sometimes we are ready to invest in Series A, even though it sort of doesn't have what we would require 5 years ago, just because we do have conviction that this business can take off, and we do have conviction that the founder will figure it out once he has that product market fit solved.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry, go on.
I would just reiterate Tom's point on it depends on the founder from another angle too, where I think certain founders just want to have more stability in the business before they go raise a Series A than others, right? And I think that's a personality trait, right, as well. I think some people are more conservative and wanting to have like a really well-established thing before they attach that rock to the accelerator. I think other people's are a little bit more risk tolerant, where they're like, I'm ready to fundraise and grow rapidly and go for it. I think finding the balance between those two things is one of the challenges as a founder, right? You don't want to wait too long to raise your Series A and be too conservative, but you also don't want to be too risk tolerant and get ahead of your skis a little bit. So I think that's another axis on how to think through it. From the founder perspective, I think you don't want to raise the Series A until you feel like you're ready to raise the Series A. I think increasingly nowadays you'll have investors who push you to fundraise earlier. And it's important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, you get to make that decision, and you should wait until you feel like you have the business in a place where you feel comfortable taking on that additional capital.
Absolutely. I think that the founder, like you mentioned, probably knows themselves, right? The best, the best timing for that to happen. And as well, I think if you get a bit head over heels and you start scaling something and actually start getting huge amounts of customers to your product without the product actually working or without you being able to handle it, that's what you don't want to happen. So I think that's what's not usually mentioned. The reason why you should wait is because it's actually good for you, right? You should be ready, not wait too long. I think there's some sort of a magic moment where you have to really make the decision. But I think timing is everything. I'm thinking, when we are at the beginning of Series A, I think every fundraising process starts with reaching out to investors, right? Getting back in touch with those that had helped you in your seed round, getting in touch with new investors. Bryan, how can I, as a founder, get in touch with the investors that I haven't met yet, that are not in my seed, that haven't funded me before? And those I really want to reach out to, maybe on more of a global scale, let's say.
Yeah. I think warm introductions are always the best introductions, right? And there's a couple of different ways to attack that. One is, particularly for a Series A, right? You presumably have a seed investor, and they can often get in touch with they already know, right? The investor that you're trying to get in touch with, or they might know someone who knows someone. I think the investing community is relatively small, so that's one angle and one way that seed investors can be helpful to companies as they raise a Series A. Mm-hmm. The other one is other founders, right? That could be founders that you're friends with. That could be other founders in the seed fund's portfolio. That's likely another great way to get an introduction to someone at a venture fund. But I think, to the extent that you can, trying to find a warm introduction through someone that you may mutually know is probably the best way to go about doing it. That said, cold emails can work as well. I just think for a cold email to be effective, you have to have, to Tom's point, a very compelling narrative, right? That really jumps out at people. Whereas with the warm introduction, I think people are more likely to explore something that's a little bit less fully formed.
Absolutely. Tom, what are there any steps you would recommend founders to take before they start raising? Bryan actually mentioned, connecting with other founders is a good step to take. Are there any other, recommendations?
I would recommend that you don't necessarily have to be super official about it at the very beginning. So, you don't have to show up for the very first meeting with the whole team and polish the deck. You can just sort of bounce the ideas of people. You can get feedback and you can understand what that specific fund is actually looking for. Are you a good fit for them? Are you actually able to deliver what they are looking for? So, starting early with the discussions, as you would in any other fundraising, be it seed or be it Series A, I think it's helpful because it creates familiarity and it creates understanding of what the other party is looking for, rather than sort of using that one shot without having absolutely no idea what they're after. And, in many cases, you might find out that you're just not a good fit for that specific investor, or you're not a good fit for that type of capital, which is also helpful because it will inform you in how you should go about building your company, or maybe what you should change. And I would just reiterate what Bryan said. For me, the best intro is through founders. If you go through your seed investors, there's always that vested interest that they have when they sort of make their introductions to other funds. And founders, founders community is extremely collaborative community. So if one of the founders from our portfolio companies comes with an introduction, it's usually very much valued and it's usually very, very good quality. So for me, that's probably the best. But, in the times of Zoom and the lack of personal meetings, I think it's absolutely okay to do a cold email or reach out through someone in the network. It's just totally acceptable these days and should be done. And the last thing I would say is that, when you make the introduction or cold outreach, try to be as familiar as you can. Like if you speak the same language, just go and do a cold outreach to that person. Don't go through a intermediary that sort of, you don't know how well they are connected. Sometimes thinking these things through can make a whole lot of difference.
Absolutely. And I really love the part when you said, you don't need to make it as official on the beginning. So you don't really need to go and wake up one day and say, this is the day I'm starting to raise my A round, but rather go slow, maybe a few weeks or months ahead, and slowly build up your network and get connected and figure out what's the best path for you. I think that for a lot of companies, they actually start raising when it's a little too late. Not a lot of them probably, but taking this approach is really sounds really smart to me. All right, so we have done our preparation before starting to raise. We know how to get in touch with investors. We know how to prep ourselves. So let's dive into the investment process. And Tom, I have another question for you, and that is, how do you, as the investor, get to know the project and the founder? How do you get either connected with them? How do you find out more about the startup, about the idea? How you discover what the founder is made of?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, there's clearly a difference in what was how things were working a year ago and now. In an ideal world, we always try to meet with the founders if they're from the region, or if they're from Prague, then we always had that rule that we would meet in person, because there's just so much more you can get from that in-person meeting. And then from then onwards, if you consider that project or the founder or what they're building interesting, then the process goes within the fund in the way that we try to meet or have a phone call with the company again, or a Zoom call with the wider team. I mean, Enern itself is a very small and lean organization. We are 6 people looking at investment opportunities. So we try to get as many people on that meeting as possible, on that second meeting. And that sometimes can be all that's needed for us to form an opinion and decide to write a term sheet or write a check or make that investment. Obviously, behind the scenes, there is the so-called due diligence that includes speaking to people in the industry, speaking to our founders that might have a very good opinion about these things, sort of leveraging the network and leaning on the network that we have in order to make that opinion about why we want to invest, and sort of support that imagination that we need to have in order to have an idea what and why that company could be successful in the future, and why that founder can be successful. I sort of a year ago, I probably couldn't imagine making an investment purely on based on a phone call or a video call. Right now, it's a reality, but if I could choose, I think I would still prefer to at least meet the founder or meet the founding team at the sort of very end of the process, because there's lots of things that you just don't see on a video call. Mm-hmm. If you do, you can do it on the Zoom call, and you don't miss these things because you don't see them. But if you remember them, then you know that they're valuable. So I do hope that at some point we will go back to with the people in that are close to us geographically, that we will be able to see them and make that bond and understand who we want to back, because it's a relationship that can last anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So deciding in the period of 1 week based on 2 1-hour phone calls sometimes might not spot things that are important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. On our last funding talk event, where we focused on seed round, Andrej Kiska from Credo Ventures mentioned his favorite line, and that is, it's like choosing your wife over Zoom, right? It's a very long relationship that it's not that easy to get out of, right? Because you have a long-term commitment. So I absolutely agree with you that the process has changed, and there's it's very different now. But there's also a lot of possibilities, right, to get in touch with more companies faster and
absolutely
get everyone connected. So thank you so much.
What it does is that there are no borders. you can make investment into companies that are sort of, we had the rule that we would invest into companies that are 2 hours flights from where we are, so that we can actually meet them and be with them and sort of be around. But that doesn't necessarily apply anymore, because you can be anywhere at any time around the globe. So I mean, it just opens a lot more possibilities. It has its drawbacks, but it opens a lot more a lot more opportunities on the other end. So it has its pluses and minuses.
Absolutely. Bryan, over to you. What does your process at Index Ventures look like? And how many meetings do you take with your startups before you decide to invest?
Yeah. I think Tom covered the vast majority of how we go about it as well. I think the other thing I would add is I tend to be very research driven, and so I have the advantage of working predominantly in kind of open source and software infrastructure. And the beauty of that is that, developers and engineers and data scientists, they'll go on the internet and tell you how they feel about stuff. So you can comb through Reddit and Twitter and Hacker News and watch conference talks and all this sort of thing. And there's a wealth of information that can be gleaned from that. In addition to kind of GitHub metrics, which I think have become kind of a much talked about thing. There's some nuance to how useful those can actually be. So I do a lot of that as well. And then I try the product, right? I think as part of the diligence process, one of the big things for me, particularly when you're investing in the early stages where you don't have necessarily as many metrics on the go-to-market and the sales repeatability and all that kind of stuff, you're making an investment on the team, who you get to know through meetings and their backgrounds, as well as the product itself. So for a lot of my early stage investments, I spent a lot of time poking around with the product and getting a sense for it. In terms of how many meetings, it really depends. I think in the same way that Series A's are getting done with less traction, so to speak, I think you're also seeing them get done a lot quicker, right? So I think the goal is to spend as much time with the team as you possibly can. But sometimes these rounds move very, very quickly, and it's only a couple of days. So in an ideal world, I think you kind of have a relationship from after they raise the seed, which we talked about a bit, where you're kind of getting to know them before the Series A fundraise, such that by the time they are raising that Series A, you already know them pretty well, and it can be a pretty quick process. In the case where you don't, I think the key meetings are generally the first one where you kind of get the pitch, a second one where you introduce them to more of the team, a third one where you spend more time with the founders on a personal level. I think this used to be going out to dinner, going out to drinks, something where you're spending a longer period of time where you're not just running through a pitch deck to get to know the people behind the business. That's increasingly difficult these days because it's just very hard to mimic that over Zoom. And if you're eating dinner and having a good time, you can do that for 2.5 hours, but no one wants to sit in front of a Zoom for 2.5 hours.
Absolutely.
So you have to get a bit creative with that part. But I think that piece is super, super important because you are engaging in this very long-term relationship. And then the last one is obviously kind of the partner meeting. So to the extent that we can, even in the short, compressed timelines, getting those 4 meetings is ideal at a bare minimum.
Amazing.
I would just add to that it's important to understand how that specific investor operates in terms of making the decision about the investment. Some firms need unanimous voting of the partners to decide on the investment. Some, for example, like ourselves, we don't actually need that for checks of a specific size, and not even for checks of a larger size. It just needs to be more than half. But it's very important to understand sort of when you and who you speak to and who is the decision maker and how many people you need to sort of get excited about your company, because then, you might be speaking to one person, but then realize later on that there's another 5 people that sort of need to get on board. So that's always very, very important, and I would suggest for the founders to ask that question during the meetings, because then they know how they should go about pitching that idea and convincing people around the table.
Absolutely. I think in a lot of sense, the Series A is sort of the breaking point, right? Whether the company is sort of going from this early stage startup to this scaling business. Do you think, in your opinion, Bryan, that Series A is harder to raise than a seed round? Or is it actually easier because you already have some previous investors who backed you up? What's your experience, maybe feedback from founders you got recently?
Yeah, I think it's always case by case, but in general, it's harder, right? Mm-hmm. With a seed investment, the check size is smaller. It's kind of understood that you'll have very little in terms of product, and so if you can craft, to Tom's earlier point, a good narrative. That's really the challenge of the seed often is, do you have expertise in the area? Do you have a good idea? And can you craft a compelling narrative around that idea? Mm-hmm. At the Series A, in general, you have to have proven out a little bit more, and the check size is much bigger, right? Usually on the order of, 5 times, right? Mm. So naturally that's a much larger decision. And I think that's why it's key at the seed stage to kind of make sure you've locked in on what is the metric for my business that matters for when I go to raise that Series A, and how can we work towards making sure that metric is growing in a healthy way. And that metric can be very different for different businesses, right? So Grid.ai, a company I invested in, it's an open source company. For them, it's largely GitHub stars and adoption of PyTorch lighting their framework. For DeepNote, a seed company that I invested in Prague, it's user growth, right? And Clara, you're quite familiar with DeepNote, obviously. But in both those cases, they were kind of really laser locked in on this is the metric that we care about from the seed to the Series A. And I think that's the most important thing to make your Series A fundraise go as smoothly as possible.
Absolutely. Tom, what do you think? Is Series A harder to get or easier to get than the previous rounds?
Yeah, I mean, on average, it's much harder to raise than seed. As I said, that seed investors, there is not much you can lean on in terms of the data to back up, other than sort of imagination of what it could be. Whereas in Series A, you start to get, albeit it's moving, but you sort of have to prove that what you are doing actually sort of in the real world, that there's a history of that you achieved something. And therefore it's much more evidence-based than it would be at the seed stage. And if you don't have that evidence, or if you don't have the right evidence, or you don't have the evidence that the investor thinks it's right, then it's so much more difficult to convince them why that matters. And obviously, because the rounds are bigger, the sort of the diligence that goes into assessing that opportunity from the point of investor is much more it's going much more deeper than when there is not much to research on. And that's one point. And the second point is that the investors that invest in you at an early stage, be it pre-seed or seed stage, they usually sort of have to follow up, or it's it's considered a negative signaling for the investors that come after them if they don't take part in the investment round. But as I explained, the way the investment funds and the VC funds work is that you make a number of picks and then you double down on the winners. So you also need to convince the people that work with you. If they don't have conviction about things not going the right way, then it's not just about finding the external investors. Sometimes, based on who you picked in the first round, you might have to convince them that they should add to the round, and that's why it can get much more difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned sort of that there are different stakes for the different investors involved, in the seed stage and then in the Series A. And we have a really good question from Katka from the company Sparring, which is how to best balance the right position of seed and Series A investors, especially in the case in the seed round, the investors are, insisted of getting more control of the company, but then you have the Series A investors coming in, and investing a larger amount. So, and Tom, to you, and then I would love to hear Bryan's opinion on this as well. How have you balanced this in the past when you've had either a different investor coming in on a Series A, or when you were coming in on a Series A to a company that raised a seed from somebody else before?
Yeah, it largely is a question of standards and supply and demand. So, how much power do you have to choose the investor and then tell them what the terms of the round are versus is there just one investor willing to invest and you just have to accept the terms? And the second one, obviously, is the question of standards. It usually makes sense for the company to have investors follow some rules of thumbs of what are the terms of the investors coming to the company, just because there is going to be someone else who comes after them. And if they see terms that are unusual or are too much skewed towards the new investors, well, guess what? They'll just ask for the same. So it's not helping anyone. And if you know that a company is going to go through a number of fundraisers, then investors that are experienced, they are not going to ask for things that are outside of the standard. And if they do, they're just harming themselves. So, I think even in the region where the venture capital industry wasn't as developed sort of 10 years ago, over the past 10 years, we can see that the standards are being set and that that investors understand the benefits of doing things in in a standard fashion and not in non-predatory fashion, where they would sort of take a large chunk of the company, or they would control too many things, or they would sort of leave the founder with a very, very little stake, or sort of terms that you can call hairy terms that it's difficult to touch after, even though the company might be doing well.
Right, sort of a gentleman's agreement, unwritten sort of a tradition. Absolutely. What's your experience, Bryan, in terms of balancing out between seed investors and Series A investors?
Yeah. I think the first two things I would say is when you're raising your seed, to Tom's point, make sure you understand kind of what the terms are, and the seed investor isn't sneaking anything in there that's non-standard. And I think the best way to do that is really to ask your founder friends and even other investors, right? If I was to not invest in a particular round, but then the founder came and said, hey, do these terms look normal to you? I'm, of course, happy to help them think through that. That's one. And two, ask your seed investor how they think about their strategy in terms of long-term involvement, right? I'd say many seed funds, their approach is, hey, we are all hands on deck until you raise the Series A, and then we kind of pass it off. We focus on getting folks from seed to Series A, and that's kind of our business. And so they're going to be happy to kind of relinquish that ownership to the Series A investor. And in general, when that's the case, which is, I think, the most common case, the Series A investor takes a board seat, the seed investor does not take a board seat, and you kind of go from there. There's also, obviously, that's kind of control in terms of the board, right? The second one is control in terms of ownership. I'm not sure if the question is getting at one or the other. That does come up, right? If you're a seed investor and you invest in a company that's doing really, really well, because of the power law nature of the business, you often want to try to get more ownership, right? And I think that, unfortunately, it's just one of the realities of, it's a good problem to have because it means that your company is doing well. But that's one of the biggest challenges of being a founder, is trying to figure out how to navigate the desire to get your new investor the ownership that they're looking for to justify the investment, while also making sure that the folks that have helped you along the way have are getting what they're looking for as well. And so I think you just have to have hard conversations. And if you pick the right seed investor or investor in general, I think people understand that everyone's on the same team, and that, at the end of the day, the way I think about it is what's best for the business is best for the investors too, right? So it doesn't make sense to be greedy for an extra 1% of the business if that's going to potentially be detrimental. And so making sure that you pick people who are on the same team as you from day one, I think is the most important part to avoid some of these situations.
Absolutely. Thank you for answering that audience question. I thought it was very, very interesting one. Coming back to some of the questions I had, sort of following up the investment process and, getting, after the investment. Bryan, you mentioned that, for example, for your seed companies, you might choose a different, a growth number that you follow and track towards, the possible Series A round. And I have a question, when it comes to the Series A, because not a lot of companies actually make it to Series A, what are the stakes that you have for your founders? What do you expect them to achieve with their Series A round? What do you track? What do you look at? When once they raise the money from you?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, if you're your average venture-backed startup, once you raise a round, the goal is to get to the next round because you're likely going to need more capital, and so you kind of want to optimize for doing the things that are going to make it likely that you raise a Series B. Again, kind of like all this stuff varies business to business. Abstractly, I think in general, at the Series B, you're looking for a business that has really strong fundamentals and a really repeatable revenue motion. So that could be a sales motion in B2B. That could be strong marketplace growth in a marketplace, order volume in a marketplace business. But you want to put yourself in a place where when you go to raise a Series B, you go, hey, look, this is working. We know this is working. And we want to raise a lot of money to really pour fuel on this fire and just expand, right? Expand geographies, expand our sales force, whatever it might be. But you want to have a guarantee that if you, in the B2B sense at least, if you raise that money, you add another salesperson, that they're actually going to be productive and effective. And so you can use that money to scale it out in a way where you're continuing to grow, which is where the repeatability comes into play. So I think that's the key thing with the Series A is how can we get to that Series B? And often that Series B means getting to a foundation where you have a very repeatable, mechanical go-to-market motion.
Absolutely. In terms of the founders, Tom, you actually talked about this a little bit on the beginning, and I would actually love to expand on that now a little. And that is, what are you looking for in your founders? What are some of the different skills or habits or, even personality traits that you feel like are the right fit for the founder to, grow the company in the right way, in the good way that you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a number of sort of values or characteristics that we look for. And I'll just mention a couple of them that I feel are probably the most important. Like we like to think that the strong why for a founder of why he's doing, why he's building a specific company and what specifically he's building. So the story of that is very important to us, and that is usually something that we look for that goes beyond the financial aspect of things, that it's not just to make money, but it's because of something else. The reason why I think it's important that, building the company takes a long time and it gets tough on occasions. And when you're really, really down, you need to have something more than just sort of a lot of money in the future that will keep you going. You need to have that sort of very strong reason why you are changing something, why you are sort of willing to take that extra risk, to go the extra mile, to build something. And it also adds to that narrative and the believability of that narrative, because you don't you're not just a good. You don't need to have that good narrative just to raise money. You need to have that good narrative to get people into the company, to convince them that they should work with you, that they should take that ESOP and maybe a massive cut in their salary when compared to a big corporation where they could be working. You also need that narrative when speaking to journalists who will tell the world about what you are building. So unless you have that strong why, you will probably not be able to have that narrative that is believable. Another point that we like to obsess about is something that we call Aspirin Thinking. And that is that the solution that you are doing really is a painkiller, that it actually solves a pain of the customer. And it's not something just nice to have, but there is an actual need that needs to be solving. And to that end, also obsessing about the customer experience. Founders that sort of are mentally wired to always think about making that customer experience the first thing and making it better is very important. And then there are more personal characteristics, like sort of having the great founders that would go through walls to achieve what they want to achieve is very, very important. And also things like, are you a fast iterator? Do you have that impatience in you to build something? And that sometimes can be seen on how they answer the questions, how they answer emails, how fast they answer emails, how impatient they are to actually tell you that what they are doing is the right thing. So I think these are small indications of people that are able to actually build the companies that will change the status quo, or they have good ambition to build something that's meaningful and that's lasting in the future.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned the word patience, because I think I read this somewhere that founders that only sort of live on passion for their company don't make it that far as those that have the discipline and the patience, right? Because it's not always all positive and it's not always easy to build your own business. So I'm really happy that you mentioned that. Great. We have another few questions from our audience. And the one I'll start with is from Karel, from one of the startups here in Czech Republic. And his question is, parents have their favorite child. Do you, as an investor, have a favorite portfolio company? Tom, I'll start with you.
Well, I always thought that parents actually love their children equally. So on that note, we like all of our portfolio companies. Obviously, some companies just maybe happen to be more at the right time, at the right place, but that doesn't mean that we would not like the rest of the companies anymore. So, so that's the answer to that question.
Absolutely. Bryan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think of the investor company relationship actually more like siblings, right? In a variety of different ways, right? Siblings are going to give you tough feedback, but you know that it comes from the right place. And in the same way, I think you learn different. I have two siblings, for context, and they're very, very different. And I learned very, very different things from both of them. And I think that's one of the fun things about working with a variety of portfolio companies is that no two are the same. And I'm constantly learning from both the founders and the company, people at the company more broadly every day. And so it's actually hard to really even compare them. So I guess a similar response to Tom's, I think I don't necessarily have a favorite. I think there are different things that I learn from different ones, and that's what makes the job so fun.
Absolutely. Thank you both for answering. I think that was a tough one, and I loved both answers. We have another question around exits and attracting larger companies. And for that question, I actually have an answer of my own, which is follow our Funding Talks event, because our next event will be on IPO. And our sixth event will be on exit. So we'll actually cover all the different stages that a company can take. So we can talk a bit more about that. We have a few other questions on starting a business and, putting together a business plan. And I think this goes back to, again, our early events. So I would encourage everyone who's sort of interested in those steps to look at our YouTube channel and go through our angel events, accelerator events, or even Series E events where we talk to different investors how to put all of these things together. Amazing. So we're surely running out of time. So I do have one last question for our amazing speakers. And I would love to ask Bryan, you, what are some of, what is an advice you would give to founders that are listening to us today regarding raising their Series A round, what they should prepare for, what they should look out for, what they should expect, if you have any sort of advice for them?
Yeah, I think it's maintain focus is one of the biggest things at any point in a company. Craft a compelling narrative. Tom's brought this up a couple of times, and I couldn't agree more. I think that's such a huge part of people that are great at fundraising. It's as a founder, a lot of what you're doing is a sales role, right? And I think fundraising is a form of sales, right? So take what you have with regards to the metrics and craft the best narrative that you possibly can, given the situation. And then make sure that you find an investor to the siblings thing. Make sure you find an investor that you like and you trust and you respect, right? I think you need all three of those things because you're going to be on a long journey and you're going to have some really hard conversations, and you want to make sure that the people sitting around the table with you are people who you think have your best interest in mind, right? And that's going to be beneficial for you whether the business ends up trending positively or trending negatively, right? I think the best references you can get on investors is actually from folks who worked with them in businesses that didn't work out, because I think that's when people's true colors comes out. So if you can get to those folks, make sure you do, and just make sure you pick people that you really have a lot of trust in. Absolutely.
The trio, like, trust, and respect. I think that's really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. Tom, over to you. Do you have any advice for the founders listening to us today or on the recording about going to get their Series A funds?
Yeah, I think it's. My advice would be to dream big and have aspirations. And also for the ones that maybe are not as far as raising Series A yet, it would be that, in my opinion, it is the best time to actually go and start a business today. There has, probably never been a better time. There's more capital available than ever. There is a lot of infrastructure that you can build upon. There are communities that you can be part of that can help. And surely people have doubts about whether it will work or not. And everybody has them. I think what works for me sometimes is to imagine what the worst outcome is. And if you can live with it, then it's probably not that bad, because you can always start another business after that if the first one doesn't work out. So, I think I would say that if you have an idea that you love, then why waiting until tomorrow if you can start today? So I would encourage everyone to start, and then leverage the community. If you need help, then people can always reach out to. I'm sure that Bryan would agree to either one of us or you guys at the Czech Run Shine to ask for help or mentorship. So. That's the nice thing about the technology community and the venture capital industry, that it's very collaborative, and I like that about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, and as well as including our community and offering to help. You can definitely find both Tom and Bryan on LinkedIn. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. If you have a great idea or are looking for an investor, I think they'll be very happy to talk to you. And it's a wrap for today. We went a little over time because we started a little later. So thank you for bearing with us. a huge round of applause goes to our speakers joining us today. So Tom and Bryan, thank you so much again for taking the time to talk to everyone today. We'll be sharing the recording of this event on our YouTube channel, and it was great to have everyone here. So Bryan, thank you for joining us, and Tom, thank you so much as well for being here.
Thank you, Clara.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Amazing. All right, everyone. Feel free to join us in the networking lounge, which will open very soon after we end this session. Like I said, if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to reach out to them on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions for me or about our community, be sure to visit our website or just follow us online at either Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We share a lot of content every single day. So yeah, be sure to check that out. Thank you all for coming today, and have a great, amazing rest of the day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.